Next up, we have Ash, which is currently Rick Zero's Chief Strategy Officer, advisor at Liquidity, and formerly growth at some of the ecosystem's biggest names, which are Uniswap and MakerDAO. So please have a warm welcome from Ash.
Thanks so much. And thank you to Shali for having me out. It's nice to be in Tel Aviv. This is actually my first time here, so it's been interesting. The food here is fantastic. I don't know how I'm ever going to leave. Cool. So today I'm going to be talking about hyperstructures. I want to clarify that this is not my idea. This is actually a concept created by Jacob from Zora, and he has a really great blog post that outlines it. I have made it a little more stylish, improved upon it, added to it, but credit to Jacob for something that has really inspired me and gotten me really excited about lots of different things that are happening in the space. So first, I want to just talk a little bit about why I wanted to talk to this room about this. So this is a developer conference. The reason that hyperstructures are important is going to be outlined in this talk, but the reason I want to talk to you guys about it is because the only people that can really make decisions about how to build applications at the end of the day are the developers, and the impacts that those applications have are extremely important. So my job here today is to pitch you all. I want all of you to be building hyperstructures after this talk, and feel free to come find me after if you have any questions. So I'm first going to start by talking a little bit about traditional software revenue models. So, uh-oh, this thing is not working. Oh, yes it is, it's just slow. Okay, great. Awesome, so there are a few basically hyperstructures are a way to build free software, and I'll get into a little bit more detail about what exactly that means, but just to go over a couple of traditional software models, we've got SaaS, that's Slack, HubSpot, Salesforce, any application that's basically selling like a monthly subscription model for an exchange for using their software services. Then you've got licensed software, that's Microsoft, IBM, lots of other examples. That's kind of like one of the most common ways of selling software. And then you've got the freemium model, which is Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, etc. The freemium model is actually, it's kind of a newer software type, and it's really kind of a dark model. Instagram doesn't exist without users taking photos. Google doesn't exist without people writing reviews or adding the locations of businesses to Google Maps. And so what that means is that like all of this content and information and data is created by users, it's owned by the platforms, and then the platforms sell it to advertisers so that we will buy things. Everybody knows this story. This is not new information. But what does it mean in practice? It means that you are the product, but you don't get to participate in the revenue model. So the system is completely extractive. And the crux of the issue is that users don't control the platforms that they co-create, and this like constant need for revenue is causing friction between the needs of users and the needs of the platform. And really, we should be building infrastructure layer platforms in ways where the needs of the user and the needs of the platform are harmonious, if that makes sense. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. So people need infrastructure. We want it to be evenly distributed as well. So software infrastructure that only exists in America is really, really bad, right? We want free software that can take the whole world with it on the journey, right? In much the same way that Facebook has allowed everyone across the globe to connect and have access to faster information, we want equal and evenly distributed software. So now we will talk about getting into hyperstructures. So that's unstoppable software that's going to change the fabric of the internet. I'm really, really excited about these. I really think that I've stumbled upon an idea that people can grasp hold of, especially developers, especially technologists, and there's so many different applications of what this technology could look like. But at the high level, what it is infrastructure layer software, which can be used for free by anyone, anywhere in the world, to do a lot of the basic operations that we do day to day. exchange. You've got Uniswap. I'm hoping to see more hyperstructures built in the social media world, in the data in the data exchange world. There's lots and lots of different places for these things to exist. But all of them have some really specific criteria. So this is kind of if you're thinking, hey, maybe this is something that I want to build, then this is what you need to focus on. These are the things that need to be included or a feature of your product in order to be considered a hyperstructure. So the first is that it needs to be unstoppable. So because hyperstructures are running on blockchains, they can't be turned off and they don't require maintenance. So this is really cool. This is actually one of I always say that the most exciting things to me in technology are not the things that we can move onto blockchains from the old world and make them decentralized just because. I'm more interested in use cases where where basically it couldn't exist in the default world, right? And that is like the most true of unstoppable hyperstructures. So it basically means that it runs for as long as the protocol as long as the blockchain that it runs on exists, which could be like hundreds of years, potentially, maybe more. I mean, I don't know. Ethereum's just getting started, but let's see. So, I'm sorry, I lost my place here. Okay, cool. So yeah, it's a superpower that we have no real prior example of. You have a one-time creation cost for actually writing the software itself, and then in perpetuity, or as long as the blockchain lasts, the software will run exactly as designed without degrading. There's no further labor or capital required to sustain it, and if the core team or platform that is built on top of the hyperstructure were to disappear, it would still run exactly as designed and be fully operational for decades. So that means that these things are really, truly unstoppable, and that is one key feature. That's the first thing that you need to have to be a hyperstructure. The second thing is that it must be free. We like free. Free is very important because of what I talked about earlier around access and having evenly distributed access for infrastructure layer software across cultures and countries. So because for example, Uniswap doesn't require maintenance, right? We deployed the contracts, they live on, people put liquidity in them, people trade against it, and the Uniswap team the Uniswap team is still doing things. They still build applications that support the protocol, they communicate about the protocol, but they're not actually changing the protocol in any real way, which is why it's able to be free. Second thing. So just because something is free does not mean that it is not valuable. So hyperstructures can be simultaneously free to use and extremely valuable to own and govern. This is a familiar value model that we observe for NFTs. The media can be universally free to consume, yet valuable to own. So if I own, everyone always says about NFTs, like, what about, right-click save? Anyone could just save that image on their computer, right? NFTs are worthless, and yet, owning, I could save all of the punks, all 10,000 crypto punks out there on my computer, and yet the CryptoPunk NFTs are still valuable, right? So ownership is what's valuable here. And what does ownership mean in this context? So ownership means the presence and control, for example, in Uniswap, of a fee switch that can be turned on across the protocol. It could also mean other ways of extracting value. So the ability to gain future revenue from the protocol is what gives the protocol value in and of itself. The threat of the fee is enough to make the Uniswap token, for example, have value, right? Because if Uniswap turned on a fee, they would be earning, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. They don't need to turn it on to prove that they can, right? So that gives the token an underlying value. But turning the fee on would be a destructive action because it would immediately lead to an incentivized fork. Someone would just create another version of Uniswap and without, fork out the fee. So the right to destroy, one other thing that I want to say about ownership is the right to destroy is another piece of value, basically. So, for example, the Uniswap token controls the treasury, and the token holders could vote to just burn all of the tokens in the treasury, right? So the right to destroy a piece of the control of what you have already made is also a feature that gives value to these things. So in closing on this point, the long-term success of Uniswap protocol depends on it being free, and all it needs to do is be the best version of itself, and it will continue to grow. So inherently, it doesn't need revenue. The next feature of a hyperstructure is that it has expansive fees. So these are transparent, equal opportunity incentives that drive value to the growth of the protocol. So expansive fees are built-in incentives that can be utilized by anyone that is adding value in a codified manner on top of the protocol. So the fees are transparent and available to the entire ecosystem. So everybody knows what they are. Anyone can participate in whatever that fee structure is. There's no permission here, right? It's open access. To effectively earn the fees on top of these hyperstructures, you need to provide the desired value as defined by the protocol. And the presence of these incentives provides a mechanism for community expansion of the hyperstructure. And good mechanism design here is critical for longevity. There's no need for a middleman fee if you design the right mechanisms into the software itself. So some examples of this are that in the Uniswap, I'm sorry I keep going back to Uniswap, there aren't that many examples of hyperstructures that are working in practice yet, and I think it's a familiar model for everyone. But look forward to hearing about all the hyperstructures that you create in the future. But in the example of Uniswap, in the liquidity pool, when liquidity pool providers deposit liquidity, they are able to earn fees in exchange for anyone that trades against that liquidity. That fee doesn't go to the protocol. It doesn't go to Uniswap's creators. It goes directly to the liquidity providers. And what does this incentivize? This incentivizes more and more liquidity to flow into the Uniswap platform. As that happens, the prices on Uniswap become cheaper. As more and more liquidity stays with the protocol itself starts to really pick up steam as this kind of like crazy force. And so the liquidity fees are actually designed to help the protocol grow. And we've seen a lot of like weird, there's been a lot of weird, I guess, liquidity mining experiments that have happened over the last couple of years. Lots of kind of sketchy promises of 30%, APY. These types of things I would avoid messing with them if you're trying to build a hyperstructure. I think that it takes time and it takes attention to build in really strong, like thoroughly baked incentives that will help the product grow organically. And so taking shortcuts by offering people free tokens in exchange for using your in exchange for using your platform, if you have to do that, then you probably need to go back to the drawing board on designing if you're trying to build a hyperstructure. Because it's meant to be, it's meant to be a piece of infrastructure. Okay, so the next necessary quality for a hyperstructure is that it must be permissionless. And there are two kind of key things here. One, that means that it's universally accessible to everyone without prejudice. And two, it's unable to change its core operating functionality. So permissionlessness is a guarantee that is unique to crypto protocols deployed on blockchains. It means that a hyperstructure, as I said, is universally accessible, and that everyone can use it without prejudice, and that you can trust the code, right? It's unable to change its core operating functionality. So the implication here is actually really huge. It means that everyone can confidently build their own platforms, applications, and economic models on top of the hyperstructure without the risk of deplatforming. There's no API keys required. There's no fear that a platform can suddenly upend your entire project on a whim. So what that means is that you can actually, by building a hyperstructure that is a core piece of software infrastructure, other platforms can use what you've built inside of their code and trust it. Trust that it's not going anywhere, that it's not going to be shut off. So this was one of the things that we worked on a lot at Uniswap, actually. It was a big part of my role is we had, I think by the time we launched version 3, we had over 200 integrations, which meant that the Uniswap code lived inside of over 200 other applications. So think like gaming, any of the other DeFi apps. Oftentimes the user wouldn't even necessarily know that they're interacting with Uniswap at some point in the code, right? Because something just needs to swap in the middle of a transaction, and you don't necessarily need to surface that to the user. So being able to build on top of something in a reliable way, in a way that you know you're not ever going to have your access turned off to it, and you know that the software is never going to change, is really, really important for helping spread infrastructure and hyperstructures. Okay. This is kind of a related note, but, well, they're all kind of related. But another really crucial feature of hyperstructures is that they need to be credibly neutral. So as a result of being permissionlessness and unstoppable, they are credibly neutral. They're user agnostic. They do not discriminate for or against specific people based on their race, gender, nationality, etc. They treat everyone fairly. They're universally accessible for anyone to utilize, build on top of, and integrate into their own systems without any risk of deplatforming or exclusion. They treat every participant fairly to the extent that it's possible to treat people fairly. And they don't have an opinion about how the hyperstructure itself is used. So for example, and this is like kind of a dicey point, I guess I would say, but you don't get to control who uses your hyperstructure or for what. So in the example of Uniswap, right? People can trade, anyone around the world with an internet connection can trade against any Uniswap liquidity pool. And we're already seeing it with I don't know if you guys are familiar, I'm sure everyone's heard about the Tornado Cash, basically sanctions by the US Department of Treasury. But what happened is that Tornado Cash was a mixer, which allowed you to basically wash your tokens, launder your dirty tokens if you had, I don't know, gone to the Silk Road or something like that. And the US Department of Treasury sanctioned those tokens. So any tokens that were coming out or touched and addressed that had interacted with the Tornado Cash software was basically banned. And what people started doing was putting all of that liquidity into Uniswap liquidity pools. So now all of that is sort of commingled. There's no way for Uniswap to do anything about it, right? There's no way to prevent money from coming into a hyperstructure. This is actually an interesting problem. It's one that we're working on at Risk Zero, which is my newest project. It's a ZK-focused scaling solution. So we're building a layer 1, and we're going to be building a decentralized proving service, which is exciting, and more to come on that. But at the moment, I just wanted to say that Uniswap has to be credibly neutral, right? So it can't differentiate between dirty tokens and clean tokens. This is a good thing, but it also means that there's a responsibility in how you build your protocol there. Okay. Positive sum games. So this is another key feature of being a hyperstructure. So as a result of being free, expansive, unstoppable, permissionless, and credibly neutral, hyperstructures create a positive sum environment. By being free forever, there's no incentive for someone to one-for-one replicate the same functionality. There's no additional value capture or risk minimization that comes from doing so. At a societal level, a hyperstructure only needs to be built once. This doesn't mean that there's not an incentive to innovate. People will still have the incentive to create an alternative with superior and differentiated functionality, but simply forking the same utility will not win. This is like a really interesting point, right? Because we don't necessarily want to have lots of different versions of the same thing. The only reason, there might be, in the traditional world, we want our telecom companies and our power companies that provide utilities that we need to compete and have competitions, because we have to pay them, right? They're earning revenue. But for a protocol that is not earning revenue and is not extracting any value, we don't need duplicates of it. We don't need competition. for something that is not taking anything from us, right? Because there's no price there. Certainly, if someone builds another version of Uniswap or Liquidity or whatever, any of the existing hyperstructures that is better, people will move to that platform, right? But they won't move because they're looking to change the cost relationship that they have with that hyperstructure. Also by being expansive with fees, hyperstructures allow participants to profit directly from the value that they create for the system without needing to compete with the system itself. So for example, liquidity providers that are providing liquidity into the system, they're earning revenue off of people trading, which is great, but they have no incentive to go out and create another liquidity pool that's separate to Uniswap to earn revenue, right? Because the incentives are designed in such a way that the incentive is to actually stay in the Uniswap liquidity pool. And one other thing I would just note is that hyperstructures are made to power millions of interfaces, not just one. So I think actually I have another slide on this one. Okay, cool. So I think I'm almost out of time here, but I'm gonna wrap this up quickly. So these are some practical principles for building hyperstructures. So the first is to build generic. So as I said, hyperstructures are made to power millions of interfaces. Not millions, there are at least hundreds of interfaces for Uniswap. As a hyperstructure builder, you don't necessarily need to concern yourself with the UX of everything. Certainly make it as easy as possible, but there are going to be lots of other front ends that are being built into these systems that will be in different languages, that will support different use cases. So build as generic as possible on that level. Non-extractive fees. So use fees as a way to expand the ecosystem, not extract from it. It may be possible to extract value in the short term, but this might be a local optima that misses the broader opportunities that come from a diverse platform ecosystem on top of your protocol. So don't try to bake in a fee everywhere if you don't need one. Okay. And the next is focus on developer adoption. This one is really, really important. Basically, take a protocol first building approach. Create as many integrations as possible. An important network effect and cementing the hyperstructure as the default. That's an important network effect for cementing the hyperstructure as the default. So the more devs that are building, your code into their code, the greater the stickiness that you have is. And that means that basically your version of that infrastructure is more likely to become the default. Okay, focus on building liquidity. So on-chain liquidity, this is mostly for financial applications, but on-chain liquidity makes it beneficial for other entrants to join the ecosystem and benefits everyone else. It's a key network effect and also reduces the ability / incentive to fork. As we've seen, we had the AMM wars a couple of years ago, and as we've seen, most of that liquidity has sort of returned to the Uniswap ecosystem just because having split liquidity across the DeFi space actually is it's worse for users, right? It means worse prices in those liquidity pools. So building liquidity, very important. Ownership where possible and governance only where necessary. So create ownership and governance only where it's absolutely necessary. Too much of either, and you might find that the hyperstructure gets skewed incentives or at risk of attack. And then finally, there's a long build cycle. So don't think that you're going to build one of these things at a hackathon. It takes years and lots of careful thought and planning. These are pieces of software which are intended to last decades, if not longer, right? So there needs to be a really thoughtful process at arriving at the solutions to some of these hard problems. So don't be scared of a long build cycle. Luckily, there's still plenty of VC money flowing around this space. So, go raise some and take your time on building these things to make sure you get it right. Okay, I'm just gonna, one more minute here. I just want to say that the scale, importance, and ambition of these pieces of infrastructure, I think will be marveled at in the same way we marveled at museums, power grids, canals, dams, and ancient roads. They'll be at a scale of technology that we haven't witnessed before, and they can be more substantial than even the current social media platforms of today if we build them right, and potentially longer lasting. So a long-term view is really critical. And sorry, one more thing. Because of their immutable and permanent nature, we should optimistically create them in their purest, most free, and most beautiful, elegant form. Hyperstructures could very well be used by our grandchildren, so we have a responsibility to build them with that in mind, and we should do them proud. We have a huge responsibility to do these things correctly, so thank you so much for your time.